Hello and welcome to Atomo Workshop. Today we're going to be making Azura's Blessed Lance from the Fire Emblem series. Let's get started.
To start, I found some reference material to make a template off of. At the time, all I found was a couple of drawings of the lance and a screenshot from the game. If I had found a template, I would have used that instead. Once I had my reference images, I got to work drawing out a rough template for marking onto the craft EVA foam I would be using. To do this, I brought my images up on my phone and started sketching them out on some card, as my printer was broken, otherwise I would have just printed out the pictures to scale. I decided to start with the, pommel, and after some trial and error I came up with a basic template I could use. But then came the challenge of how to make the shape in a 3D form, and to make things more difficult, I wanted to make this lance come apart, to make transporting it easier, so I had to incorporate some sort of disconnect. My original plan was to glue together a block of foam and then drill in a hole that would house a PVC coupler, since the handle of the lance would be a PVC pipe. However, after 2 attempts, I found it ended up with the lance head being too thick and difficult to work with, and I couldn't get the right form for the collar pieces. So instead, I drew out my template again, but this time I used 2 foam sheets glued together with contact cement and cut out just the main body of the pommel, ignoring the collar pieces but still leaving a shaft for gluing later. I then used my sanding drum and my rotary tool to create the form of the pommel, leaving me with this. The shaft glues into the PVC coupler like so, which then leaves me with plenty of room to create the collars. I made the collars by using foam dowels. You can get them in a bunch of shapes and sizes, so I got a variety pack with these triangular ones. Using super glue, I slowly wrapped the dowels around the coupler, leaving an overhang just over the edge with the main body to get the spacing right. You can get the ends of the dowel to match up around the object better by cutting a bevel on the underside. The coupler was just a little too long, so I cut it down a bit to make sure it still worked okay. Finally, I capped off the end using some cuts of thin craft foam. It wasn't pretty, but I had a plan for making this better, which you'll see later on in the video.
The eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed I missed something during the assembly there. You see, if I rest the pommel on the ground, like so, it would bend over on itself because I didn't provide it any sort of support.
The easiest way I could think of to fix this after assembly was to drill a hole into the bottom and run a metal rod up the center.
That worked, but it wasn't perfect. You see, if I rest the lance in the normal pose somebody might do, it doesn't bend over on itself anymore, but the tip still does. This is because I couldn't get the metal rod all the way to the very end. If I had thought of this problem ahead of time, I could have sandwiched this metal rod between the 2 EVA foam layers before I glued them together. If you do this yourself, I suggest you put that in beforehand and be better than me.
The next job was to work out the length of the PVC pipe. Based on images of Azura, the lance head should start just above her shoulder, so I decided to cut my pipe at the lowest point of mine, keeping in mind to also account for the length of the pommel. I chopped it down with a hacksaw and gave it another test. I wanted to make sure that the lance pole wasn't floppy and had a decent weight to it, so using Gorilla Glue, I inserted a wooden dowel into the PVC pipe and made sure to twist it as I did so to spread out the glue. This actually worked perfectly.
Sadly, I lost most of my footage for the next part of the build, but I was making this core piece to the lance head. I'll try and explain it as best as I can, but it was very similar to the pommel. So, how I made this. I used 6 layers of EVA foam into a square, and then mapped out a rough shape of this little goblet type shape onto all 4 sides and cut it out. Then smoothed it all out with my rotary tool. I then also drilled a hole into the bottom and put in this PVC coupler so that it can connect to the handle piece. And then also wrapped another one of these triangular dowels onto the bottom. To make this piece, I used a centimeter thick half round dowel wrapped around the edge, leaving an overhang on both sides, and then ran a inch thick dowel up the center here. Then wrapped that with more EVA foam, shaved it down with my rotary tool, and then shaped this spike again with my rotary tool. That's how I got that general shape.
And that brings us to where my footage picks back up. My layering didn't work great when wrapping around my foam dowel. I didn't want to smooth out properly because I ran out of contact cement and tried switching to super glue. That backfired massively, as it meant when I went to sand it, chunks of foam came off instead. So to fix this, I tried something new. I decided to try some foam clay. It is essentially the same foam I have been working with, but it can be sculpted into whatever form I want, then left to dry, and it will keep that form. But before going straight to my prop, I did some tests. I wanted to see the best way to bond together the 2 pieces, as well as how things would cut in sand. I got a scrap piece of foam and marked out 2 areas. On one area, I tried attaching the clay straight out of the tub, no prep whatsoever. On the other, I tried wetting the surface with some water first. I'd heard this made the bond stronger, though I did go a little overboard here. Finally, I also made some little shapes just so I could see how they would cut in sand. After a day or two of dry time, I came back to see the results. Right away, I could see the bond for the clay without water was incredibly weak. I was able to pop it off with very little effort. The wet side took a lot more effort before giving in, and it was a lot easier to form while wet, so this seemed to be the best method. I also tried cutting and sanding my test shapes, and they cut and sand with just as much ease as the sheets of foam do. It was the perfect fit for what I needed. So I covered pretty much the entire outside of the core in the clay, making sure to bond it with water. And remember when I said I had a plan to fill in the gaps in the pommel? I used the clay to accomplish that. I stuffed it in the gaps as much as I could and then smoothed out the area with water, then left everything to dry for a couple of days. When it was all dry, I sanded it down to smooth out the surface and get my final shape.
At last, it's time to make the head of the lance. I found this to be the hardest part of the build, but I think it came out really nicely.
My first attempt was to draw out the pattern for the head by hand. I thought I could focus on just the round part of the head and worry about the main point at a later time. I brought up some reference on my phone and got to drawing. I started by tracing around the existing piece of the lance body that I had just made. That way I knew it would fit correctly. After some time, I came to a piece I was happy enough with and cut it out of foam. What I found was that it didn't match up quite in the way I wanted to. It wasn't perfectly round like it should be, since I had to do it freehand. Additionally, I found out that it would have been easier to add the blade in now instead of later. I might have been able to fix this, but instead I changed tactics. While looking for more reference, I found a really nice line drawing of the lance that would have actually worked perfectly as a template, had I found it earlier. I wanted to use this, but as mentioned before, I have no printer. So instead, I tried taping pieces of paper to my monitor and traced out the image after I scaled it to the correct size. I went over it very lightly so as to not get Sharpie on the screen itself, and got a perfect template. This time, when I traced the whole thing on the foam sheet and cut it out, I had a much more accurate representation of the lance head. Learning from my mistake with the pommel, I decided to strengthen the inside of the foam at this stage. I used more of that metal rod from earlier to accomplish this. However, this time I need to make space for it, otherwise it would show through as a bump when I put the other half of the spearhead on. I made space by carving out a trench with my rotary tool. I made sure my rod fit inside and then glued it down with super glue, leaving me with this. Then came the main glue up. I cut out a large sheet of foam, larger than the part of the spear I'd already made, and coated both sides in contact cement. I got a little impatient here and stuck it down a little too early. It worked out in the end, but could have been better had I just waited a little longer. Once glued together, I cut out the excess by using the already cut half as a guide. This left me with my spearhead roughly cut out and ready to go. Some of the edges didn't match up perfectly, so before I started shaping, I just went over all the edges with my sanding drum to tidy them up. I couldn't really get in the corners well at this point, but I managed to clean this up later anyway. Once I got everything nice and tidy, it was time to sand down to the final shape. This is an incredibly nerve-wracking part of the build. If I messed up now, I would have to start the head all over again. I started by putting a slight bevel on all the edges, and when I was done with that, I spent about another hour shaving down the blade portion of the spear. There isn't any one completely level, flat surface on the lance, so I went over the rest of it to make sure all the bevels met in the middle of each individual section. While doing that, I was able to tidy up that inner piece I mentioned before. After a total of 3 hours of sanding, I finally had it down to its final shape. It isn't perfect by any means, but I am very happy with how it came out nonetheless. It did have an issue of texture though. Foam gets very fuzzy when you sand it with the standard sanding drum. Something I should have done to fix this was to go over it again with the standard grinding bit. It leaves a much smoother surface. Unfortunately, I didn't think to do this before painting, so mine remains slightly weird. But if you make this properly the same way I did, I highly suggest you do it. Gluing on the headpiece was next. I marked out roughly where it was going to go and slathered on the contact cement. Made me very nervous to do this, but I took my time and managed to put it on straight-ish. I set it aside to fully set up and in the meantime prepped the pommel for paint. All you have to do here is go over the entire thing with a heat gun. This compresses a lot of the smaller fuzzy bits that sit on the surface from sanding. It won't help with the larger ones like on the lance head, but it helps compress things enough to allow for a smoother surface for paint. You don't want to overheat the foam either, as it can burn and is extremely toxic. You just want to go over it until it all has a bit of a shine. Additionally, to keep my hands safe away from the heat, I inserted a rod into the bottom to hold the pommel. This leaves a hole but won't be seen since this is on the inside. To give a nice base for the paint, I first went over the pommel with Plasti Dip. This is the same stuff I used on Joker's mask, but in black. It acts as a flexible layer on the top of the foam and is much better about preventing the paint from cracking when it flexes. I painted this by holding it on a scrap PVC pipe. It doesn't bond to the plastic well, so you can actually just peel it off when you're done. And while that dried, I went back to the lance head. I decided I wanted to smooth out the transition from the head to the body, so I got more of my foam clay and ran a connecting piece across the seam between the two parts. Unfortunately, this added an extra couple of days to the build while waiting for it to dry, but I think I ended up with a much better result. When it was ready, I sanded it smooth and went through the same process as the pommel, heat sealing it and giving it some coats of Plasti Dip. In total, I did 3 coats on both pieces to make sure it was well sealed and very flexible. There was then one final piece I needed to make. There's a spiral wrap around the top of the handle that feeds into the body of the lance head. I made this by cutting a length of half round dowel. I measured it by wrapping it around where it would be living and cutting off the extra length. Once at the right length, I cut a point in the end to cap it off and trimmed the back to be thinner right at the tip so it would transition into the handle better. This got the same Plasti Dip treatment in white instead as I ran out of the black.
And now the paint. I wanted to use my airbrush for this, however, at the time of filming my airbrush upped and died, so I had to switch to spray paint. Luckily I don't have to spray paint the handle because it is white anyway.
I went with a brass spray paint in the end. I started with the pommel to get a feel for how it would look. I was pleasantly surprised by the finish actually. It was fairly shiny but not overly so. I ended up doing 2 coats of this per piece, including the spiral. The first layer was a lighter coat and the second being thicker to get complete coverage. I think the lance head came out great in the end. It was really satisfying to see it slowly gain that brass color. Once it was all dry, I glued down the spiral. This was pretty tricky as it just wanted to unwind itself as I was going, but the technique I found worked best was to superglue the very top down where it touches the head of the lance, but only gluing it to the pipe. Then, I wound it around the handle and glued the tip down where I wanted it. Once those were done setting up, I carefully lifted bits of the spiral and squeezed in a little bit of superglue, then pushed it back down onto the handle. This actually ended up being my favorite part of the whole lance. I think it looks fantastic for such a simple thing.
I decided to weather this as well. I hadn't had any experience with it before, but I thought it might add an extra layer of depth to the paint job.
To do this, I went very simple and set out some brown and black paint, then watered it down. I actually used a bit too much water here and it got really runny when I was doing some of the handle. In future, I'll need to creep up on it a bit more. I first went over in the black on the pommel. You want to basically cover the area, then wipe it away again with a paper towel, but don't do a fantastic job of it. You want to leave some paint in the little cracks and crevices. This actually did a great job of darkening the brass in the end, but I also went over it with the brown to see what effect it would have. I found this left a slightly muddy look to it, which looked nice in the crevices, but not on the face of the lance, so I went over it again with the black. Once I was happy with it, I repeated all the same on the head of the lance. You could see it made a massive difference in the finish. Where I messed up though was on the handle. Like I mentioned before, it was a little runny, so it seeped down the handle when I wasn't ready and ended up staining the pipe more than I wanted it to. I was able to tidy it up again by going over the pipe with a fine sandpaper, and in the end it looked okay, but next time I would like a little more control over it so it won't use so much water.
And that's the whole build. I'm very pleased with how this came out, even if it did take a while. Originally this was supposed to be coming out around when 3 Houses was released. Of course there are things I would change about it. Like I mentioned before, there's the metal rod that needs to go in first on the pommel, and the head could do with being smoother. However, there's another issue I have not yet mentioned. It's a little wobbly. As far as I can tell, this is the main culprit area. I have a metal rod running from the bottom up to the top here. However, it just isn't strong enough. I could have maybe doubled it up to make it even stronger, but I think the better move would have been to use a PVC pipe in the top of the coupler running to the top of the dowel. Well, in any case, I'm very pleased with how it turned out. I hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you for watching. Take care.